I know what financial suffocation feels like. I do not mean ordinary stress. I mean the kind that wakes a person in the dark before dawn and leaves him staring at the ceiling as if the mathematics of his whole life have turned hostile. The kind where checking the bank balance feels worse than physical pain because you already know what you are going to see. The kind where every unknown phone number feels like a threat, every bill feels like an accusation, and every normal conversation becomes harder because shame is now sitting in the room with you. That condition is more common than respectable society likes to admit, and it destroys people for a reason that has very little to do with numbers. It destroys them because once a person falls far enough behind, he stops thinking clearly. He stops making decisions like an owner and starts making them like a hunted animal. He avoids, he postpones, he distracts himself, he dreams about miracles, he tells partial truths to a spouse, he opens fewer envelopes, he looks for one lucky break instead of one disciplined month. The fear gets larger because the unknown stays larger. That is why if I were sitting across the table from someone who was broke, maxed out, behind, embarrassed, and mentally exhausted, I would not begin with an investment tip. I would begin with psychological separation. Your debt is not your identity. Your bank balance is not your character. Your current financial wreckage may be partly your fault. Partly bad training, partly bad incentives, partly bad luck. Partly a culture built to flatter consumption and monetize ignorance. It may be a mixture of all of them. But whatever produced the mess, the first important thing is this. The mess is a number, not a soul. That sounds simple, but it matters. A person who confuses his net worth with his worth as a human being usually becomes too ashamed to face reality directly. Then he does the one thing finance never forgives. He refuses to look. I have almost no patience for avoidance in money matters. I understand it, I sympathize with it, but I do not respect it, because avoidance turns a painful problem into a predatory one. Interest does not pause because you feel bad. Late fees do not admire your intentions. Debt collectors do not disappear because you need emotional space. The market for labor does not suddenly pay you more because you are scared. Arithmetic moves whether you are looking at it or not. So the first step out of financial hell is not hope. It is exposure. Sit down, open everything. Write down every debt, every interest rate, every minimum payment, every monthly bill, every subscription, every car payment, every streaming leak, every automatic charge, every payday loan, every ugly little financial parasite attached to your life. Do not do this in your head. Paper matters. A written list turns fog into structure. And once the structure exists, fear begins losing some of its mystery. The unknown is often more frightening than the ugly truth itself. A monster with no shape grows larger in the imagination. A number on a sheet of paper is still painful, but now it can be attacked. That is the moment many people misunderstand. They think the tragedy is hitting zero. It is not. Zero is a victory when you are climbing out of a hole. Negative 20,000 is bondage. Negative 10,000 is bondage. Negative 5,000 is bondage. Zero is freedom from backward compounding. Zero is the first clean line. Zero is not failure when you came from below it. Zero is graduation. But you do not get to zero by daydreaming. You get to zero by first stopping the bleeding. That is the principle most broke people violate, because desperation makes them reach for a fence before they have stabilized defense. They think the answer is a hot investment, a lucky trade, a new token, a sports bet, a meme stock, or some other fantasy that promises speed. That temptation is strongest when a person is exhausted, because exhausted people want a dramatic solution equal to the dramatic pain. Finance rarely works that way. If you are carrying credit card debt at savage rates, there is no sane investment strategy that outruns that destruction reliably. Before you build, you must stop leaking. Before you grow, you must survive. Before you talk about compounding for yourself, you must stop compounding against yourself. That requires a kind of personal austerity that most people find socially embarrassing. Good embarrassment is cheaper than insolvency. I have a phrase for the expense that quietly ruins ordinary people while making them look normal in public. The ego tax. The ego tax is the premium people pay to preserve an image they cannot afford. It is the expensive car on a weak balance sheet. It is the upgraded phone held by a man with overdraft fees. It is the endless food delivery bought by someone who says he has no savings. It is the stack of subscriptions, brand habits, convenience purchases, financed upgrades, and socially approved luxuries that consume future freedom in exchange for present camouflage. A lot of people do not fear being poor nearly as much as they fear looking poor. That is a disastrous inversion. Looking poor for a season is survivable. Being poor indefinitely because you protected appearances is not. So if I were financially underwater, I would declare a private state of emergency immediately. Not for a weekend, not until I felt better, until the structure changed. Every subscription without a genuine purpose would go. Restaurants would go, impulse spending would go, delivery fees would go, unnecessary shopping would go, alcohol bought out of discouragement would go, status purchases would go. I would reduce my life to function. Not because I enjoy deprivation, because emergency surgery is not the same thing as ordinary living. People resist this because they think strict cutting makes life smaller. Sometimes it does in the short run, but debt already made life smaller. What austerity does is make the pain productive instead of pointless. Now let me say something that offends people who are still half in love with appearances. If you are drowning financially and driving a heavily financed vehicle, you do not absolutely need. That car is not transportation. It is an anchor. People cling to cars because cars are emotional objects in modern society. Identity, pride, proof, independence. But numbers do not care about symbolism. A large monthly payment, plus insurance, plus fuel, plus repairs, plus depreciation, can quietly consume the oxygen your future needed to breathe. There are periods in life where elegance lies in downgrading without shame. Drive the cheaper car, take the bus. Borrow inconvenience now so that you do not rent humiliation for another decade. That same principle applies to housing. If the rent or mortgage is crushing you and the only argument for keeping it is that moving would feel like admitting something, then the structure already owns you more than you own it. Pride is a terrible landlord. This stage of the rebuild is lonely. And I want to say that honestly because many people fail precisely where they expected encouragement. Friends will invite you out. Coworkers will tell you not to be so serious. People who are in just as much trouble as you are will mock your discipline because it bothers them to see someone else refusing the same self-deception they rely on. Ignore them. A person trying to recover financially must often separate from the spending habits of the herd long before he receives any reward for it. That is not cruelty. It is quarantine. And quarantine has a purpose. It creates the first pool of money that is not immediately consumed by chaos. It slows the rate of destruction. It gives you something to throw at high-interest debt. It also does something more important than that. It restores self-command. A man who has spent months living reactively begins to remember that he can direct money instead of merely watching it disappear. That psychological recovery matters more than many people think. If you feel helpless long enough, even small acts of control become restorative. So I would attack the highest interest debt first, not because every formula in the world agrees on one method and one method only, but because the highest rate debt is usually the most aggressive enemy in the room. Every dollar hurled at it reduces future damage. And in the early stage of recovery, reducing damage is more important than producing sophistication. This part is not glamorous. It may take months. It may take years. There will be nights where the whole thing feels unfair. That is normal. But unfairness does not exempt a person from structure. If anything, structure matters more when life feels unfair, because emotions become less trustworthy precisely when circumstances are hard. Eventually, if you keep cutting the ego tax and keep attacking the high-rate balance, something beautiful happens. Not beautiful in the way a luxury advertisement means beautiful, beautiful in a harsher, cleaner way. The balances stop growing. Then they start shrinking. Then one day the list of obligations on your paper finally ends, and you reach zero. People who have never been buried under debt do not understand what that number means. They think zero is nothing. They are wrong. Zero is the first morning in a very long time where the future is no longer being sold off in tiny monthly pieces, just to preserve the past. Zero is the first day your labor belongs to the present, instead of the penalty box. Zero is the point where the enemy stops multiplying against you. But let me be clear. Zero is not the destination. It is the first clean mile marker. Once the bleeding has stopped, most people feel a dangerous wave of relief. Relief is understandable. It is also risky because relief tempts people to relax too early. They want to consume again. They want to celebrate by upgrading the life that nearly killed them. They want to prove to themselves that the hard period is over. That instinct must be resisted. Because at zero, you do not yet have financial capital. You have something else, time. And if you are broke or nearly broke, time is still a form of capital. In fact, it is the one form of capital you still receive in equal daily installments, whether the bank balance is generous or empty 24 hours. The same deposit every day. Most people waste the part of that deposit that could have changed everything. That is why so many lives stay financially stuck even after debt relief or modest income improvement. They continue spending their evenings the way they spent them when they were still trapped. Consumption by screen, escape by habit, endless scrolling passive entertainment. Cheap dopamine used as anesthesia. Hours handed to platforms and distractions that return nothing but temporary numbness. That is not rest. It is liquidation of the only capital you had left. When I look at a person with no money, I do not ask only what sits in the bank. I ask what happens between dinner and sleep. That stretch of time tells me more about the next 5 years than the current salary does. If you work 8 hours and sleep 8 hours, you still hold a significant slice of the day. Not all of it is fully free, of course. Life exists, family exists, commutes exist, fatigue exists. But even after making humane allowances, most people can locate a few hours that are being sold too cheaply to distraction. I care especially about 4 evening hours, not because 4 is magical, because 4 is enough. 4 hours used repeatedly can alter a life. 4 hours squandered repeatedly can preserve poverty with astonishing reliability. Treat those hours like a rescue fund. Guard them more fiercely than broke people usually guard money, because those hours are the machine that can eventually produce money. This is where some people expect me to recommend a degree, a formal credential, or a long institutional path with borrowed money attached to it. Sometimes education is valuable. I have nothing against learning. But if you are rebuilding from near zero, the immediate question is not abstract self-improvement. The immediate question is market value. How do you become harder to replace? The labor market is not a moral institution. It does not pay according to effort, goodness, or exhaustion. It pays according to usefulness, scarcity, leverage, and replacement cost. That is the brutal truth. Many people keep trying to outvote emotionally. They say they work harder than someone else. Maybe they do, but if the market can replace them in 3 days, the market will not pay them as though replacement were difficult. Complaining about that does not change it. So the next stage of the rebuild is not merely working more. It is becoming less replaceable. That requires skill concentration. Narrow, useful, monetizable skill concentration. A man with no capital cannot afford vague ambition. He needs targeted leverage, a skill that solves a specific expensive problem, a capability that businesses or clients actually exchange money for, a service whose value can be demonstrated without waiting 10 years for permission. It may be sales, it may be copywriting, it may be editing, it may be data work, it may be coding, it may be paid media, it may be bookkeeping, it may be a technical trade, it may be one of 100 other skills. The label matters less than the principle. The principle is to stop being a general labor input and become a more specialized problem solver. That is what the evening hours are for. Study, practice, observe, build, repeat. And here is the part many people cannot tolerate. For a while there may be no visible payoff. That does not mean the effort is failing. You are converting raw hours into invisible capital. Invisible first, visible later. The same people who laughed at your canceled subscriptions will often laugh at your quiet learning period too, because they only respect results after the compounding becomes visible. They do not understand the invisible stage because they do not stay anywhere long enough to witness it. Let them laugh. Most spectators are financially unqualified to evaluate disciplined solitude anyway. I would use those evening hours mercilessly, phone out of reach. Television off, pointless social obligations reduced. Cheap digital narcotics restricted, not because leisure is evil, but because a person in a recovery phase cannot afford a life designed around constant soothing. Comfort must become earned again. Over time, if the skill is real and the practice is serious, income possibilities begin changing shape. That is when a person experiences one of the most important psychological shifts in finance. He realizes his labor is no longer the only thing for sale. His capability is for sale. That distinction matters. A replaceable laborer sells hours. A more specialized worker sells outcomes. The second has leverage, the first does not, and leverage is what turns time into better money. Now we reach another turning point that the financial world barely talks about because most people never survive long enough to encounter it correctly. The first $1,000 earned from upgraded capability feels different from ordinary wages. I do not mean emotionally only, I mean structurally. A paycheck from a job can keep a person alive, yes, but the first meaningful money earned because you solved a problem with a skill you deliberately built in the margins of your life carries a different message. It says that capital can be created from discipline before it is stored in a brokerage account. It says your mind can manufacture value independent of your old identity. It says you are no longer only defending against collapse. You are now producing. That is why the first 1,000 matters so much. Not because it is a giant number, because it changes the story you tell yourself about what is possible. But right there, at the exact moment, a person finally feels some momentum. Another danger appears, lifestyle relief disguised as reward. You worked hard, you suffered, you stayed home, you studied, you made sacrifices. Now the new money arrives and the mind starts whispering that a reward would be reasonable. A better phone, a nicer dinner, a more expensive apartment, a financed upgrade. Something to mark the beginning of the new phase. That whisper ruins more progress than people like to admit. Because the wealthy habit is not earning money, it is directing money. If the first new capital immediately becomes new consumption, then the structure has not changed, the costume changed, the structure did not. So I would treat the first 1,000 and the first several thousand after it with extreme seriousness. Do not perform success too early. Reinvest. Use the money to strengthen the skill engine, reduce remaining fragility. build reserves, and begin the smallest real snowball of capital. This is where discipline begins feeling less punitive and more strategic. Before, discipline was keeping you alive. Now discipline is building an asset base, small at first, fragile at first, but real. And a real snowball, however tiny, changes the rules of the game. Because once money begins staying, not merely passing through, the person is no longer trapped in a fully defensive posture. A reserve appears, then an investment account, then perhaps a small business tool set, then enough margin to reject bad jobs, bad clients, and bad terms, then enough capital to survive interruptions without panic. That is how freedom enters. Quietly, not by spectacle, not by lottery, not by one extraordinary opinion shouted into the internet, by a chain of ordinary brutalities handled correctly. Face the numbers, stop the bleeding, cut the ego tax, attack the high-interest enemy, reach zero, protect the evenings, build a skill, earn the first independent capital, refuse to celebrate by weakening the structure. Keep rolling the snowball. The person who can survive that chain is much stronger than someone who simply inherits a large account without understanding how it was built. Inherited money often creates comfort without competence. But the person who climbed out of debt, reclaimed his time, and learned to build income from capability possesses something more durable than a lucky starting point. He possesses rebuildability. That word matters to me. Because markets crash, businesses fail. Economies turn ugly. Families experience interruption. The person who only knows how to consume output is fragile. The person who knows how to rebuild from nothing using discipline, skill, and structure is not invincible, but he is vastly harder to keep down. That is why I think starting from zero, while unpleasant, can produce a kind of financial toughness that comfort rarely teaches. You learn what matters, you learn how cheap many social rituals really are, you learn the price of vanity, you learn the difference between entertainment and escape. You learn how to make progress while no one is clapping. You learn that the early stage of wealth is profoundly unglamorous and yet entirely honorable. And perhaps most importantly, you learn that nobody is coming. That sounds cold. It is also liberating. Once you fully accept that no politician, guru, trend, or miracle is going to rescue you, you stop waiting in the wrong direction. Energy returns. Blame shrinks. The world may still be unfair, but now your attention is finally pointed somewhere useful. That is the point. Useful attention. A person can remain broke for years, not because he lacks intelligence, but because his attention keeps being harvested by distractions, resentments, fantasies, and social pressure. Reclaim the attention, and the arithmetic often improves before the bank balance does. I do not promise easy outcomes. I do not promise speed. I do not promise that every hardworking person will become rich. But I am certain of this. A person buried in debt and shame can materially improve his future if he stops hiding from numbers, stops feeding the ego tax, stops donating evenings to entertainment platforms, and starts treating time, focus, and skill as the first real capital he still controls. That is not motivational theater. That is just common sense applied with enough brutality to matter. So if I were speaking to a man or woman sitting at the kitchen table tonight with the phone turned face down, a stack of bills nearby, and a heart full of dread, I would say this: do not ask first how to get rich. Ask how to stop lying to yourself, write the numbers down, cut the life to the bone, attack the rate that is killing you fastest, protect 4 hours, choose one monetizable skill, build it until someone pays you, then do not consume the proof, store it, strengthen the structure, repeat. That is how a financial life is rebuilt from ashes. Not elegantly, not quickly, but honestly. And honesty, once it enters a broken balance sheet, is often the first true sign that recovery has already begun.